Today we're going to look at a pretty common rendering issue that you come across in Maya from time to time. And that has to do with rendering in layers, and in particular when you have fog in the scene. So something like this. So here we are in Photoshop, and I've rendered this out in layers. So I've got this background layer, I've got a foreground layer, and then I've got this fog layer. Now the reason we may want to do this even without fog is that having the foreground and the background separate from each other allows us to do things like take the background and add some blur in post. For example, oh, okay, didn't work. Gaussian blur. So if you just want to add some subtle background blur and you don't want to rely on Arnold to do that and have it be in camera, you have to usually separate your layers into foreground and background. Now, of course, this gets more complicated when you have an animation because your camera is moving. However, the principles I'll talk about will apply there too, but we'll be looking at this in Photoshop rather than After Effects, and we won't be doing any depth pass here. That'll be something we can talk about later. This is mostly about rendering in layers and how to integrate fog into your render. And if we just want to take a look, this is what our fog layer looks like, and it's just sitting over top of our other layers, and it's added on top to get rid of the dark areas and just leave the light areas. Okay, so it will seem a little bit complicated when we get into Maya to do this, but rest assured it's not that bad. Once you get used to it, it all makes sense. So if we take a look at the scene here, we're looking at a menu that you may not have used before, but this is called the render setup. And in the past, this was called render layers, which in some ways makes more sense. And this allows us to separate scene elements into layers. So here we can see that we're looking at well, it looks like we're looking at the whole scene, but actually this is my foreground layer with the background layers actually not visible in renders. Here's my background layer, so just the background elements. And then here is my fog layer. It's got all the elements in here, but they're just black. So I'm just going to delete these layers and we'll start from scratch. So if you haven't worked with render layers or render setup before, there's good documentation about it in the My Help files. So take a look, but by going through this, you'll learn some of the real basics. So before we get started with the render layers, let's take a look at what we're trying to achieve. So if we open up the renderer, we'll just take a quick beauty pass render. So this is a render with everything in it. Oh, I can see that my fog is turned off. So let me just go in and add fog to my scene. So when you want to add fog to your scene, not the hypershade, when you want to add fog to your scene, you go into the render settings. And I shouldn't keep calling it fog because that can be confusing, because there is something called fog, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an atmosphere volume. So in the render settings under the Arnold Renderer tab, here under Environment, Atmosphere, if you click on the checkerboard, you can create an AI atmosphere volume, an AI fog volume, and an AI standard volume. You might be tempted to use AI fog, but that's not what we want in this case. An AI fog will be sort of a low-level fog, so a ground-level fog. It will have a height dimension. And we don't want that. We just want to create an overall volumetric atmosphere in the scene so you can see lights passing through and casting shadow into the atmosphere. Now I already have one here, so I'm not going to create a new one. When you click on this, and then if you want to get back to it, you click on the arrow here and go to the attribute editor. And right now my density of fog is set to 0. I'm not going to talk too much about fog, but if we just turn up the density a little bit, we'll get some fog in the scene, and you can look at all these other attributes on your own. I'm just keeping it as is. So now if I go and do a render, so this is what we're trying to achieve. This is our beauty pass here. So I'm going to save this out as an OpenEXR, and I'll just call this demo beauty fog. And let's open this up in Photoshop. I'll just close all my layers here. So demo beauty fog is somewhere. Oh, spelled beauty wrong, of course. And so when you open an EXR, it's asking you how you want to deal with the alpha channel. I don't actually have an alpha channel in here, but this is what we're trying to shoot for. But when we do a beauty pass like this with everything in the same render, we can't preferentially blur the background unless we mask it out somehow, but that's kind of a pain. So we're going to do that in Maya instead. So what we want to do is to break up our scene into foreground, background, and fog. So the fog is going to render on its own, and we'll reintroduce it to the scene in Photoshop. So up here in the status line, we've got our rendering icons, and we've used this one a lot before. This is our render settings, but over here beside the hypershade, we've got this clapboard with the 2 layers, and this is our render setup. So what we want to do is to click on here to create a new layer, and I'll call this one foreground. And I'm going to add foreground elements in here. Now I'm going to complicate this a little bit more later on, but let's just start with the beginning stage. So you can right click on the layer and say create collection, and this is a node that houses all the things you want to obey the rules of this layer and to render on their own. So this collection, I'm going to call this foreground geo, and I'll grab anything that's in the foreground and put it here. So I don't have anything really named properly, but these are all my foreground elements. You can see I am not grabbing the lights. You don't need to do that. You control the lights separately, but that's not something we have to worry about in this case. So I'm going to middle mouse drag them over here. So now they're in this collection. So if I click on the visibility icon here, you can see on this layer, we only see these objects. Okay, so now we're going to create a new layer, and we'll call this background. Right click on it, create collection, and we'll grab the background objects. So the BG type and the BG plane, we are going to drag there. Now if we click on the visibility here, those are the only things that we see. What's interesting about this is that an object can exist in more than one layer. So that's why this is different than display layers. Display layers, an object can only exist on a single display layer, so you can't just preferentially turn off display layers to render things separately. You could in some very simple situations, but as soon as things get more complex, you need the same object on different layers to do different things to make your renders work together. Okay, now finally, I'm going to make a new layer, and I'll call this fog demo. Create a collection, and in this case, I'm going to add all of my geometry here. And I'll middle mouse drag that into the collection node. So now if we look at this layer, it just looks like our normal layer. And if we were to render this, I'll just open the Arnold render view. I should save my scene. Right, so this is essentially just recreating my beauty layer. And just while we're talking about that, up here you can see there's a master layer, and this includes everything in the scene. So you can break things up into separate layers, but if you ever want to render just everything together, you can just render from the master layer up here. Okay, but we want the fog to be on its own and rendered against black objects, so we can composite it in Photoshop or After Effects on top using an add blend mode. So to do that, we have to add a new material to all of these objects here. So we're going to do that. So on the collection, we can right click and we can create overrides. Now, overrides are key concepts, is a key concept in the idea of render setup and render layers. You can add unique overrides per layer, and they don't affect any of the other layers, and they don't affect the master layer. So we're going to create a material override here. And so this will put a new material on every object on this layer. So override material, I don't have one made already, so I can just click on the checkerboard. And then what we want to add here is just a Maya surface shader. So if you haven't used a surface shader before, all that a surface shader is a shader that does not react to lights in the scene. So if we take a look at this shader here, out color is black, and this is the default, and no matter how many lights you shine on this thing, it will just be black. It will still cut out an alpha channel, but it will just render black. So now if we render this layer, just to take a look, then it looks like we just have the fog on its own. Those objects are in there, but because they're rendering black with the surface shader, all you see is their form and the depth of the fog in the scene, which is exactly what we want. So if we were to look at these layers here, so the foreground layer, if we turn on the visibility there and render, we'll get this here. Now here's the problem. We have fog on these layers too, but we want to separate the fog out so it doesn't appear in the foreground and background layer, and we'll just add it ourselves later on. Because one thing you should know about fog is that it doesn't make a change to the alpha channel. So if we look at this render that we just did here and click on alpha, you can see this whole area is cut out. And so even though the fog appears in the render, it's being cut out by the alpha, which is why we have to render it separately and bring it in. So how do we get the fog out of our foreground and background renders? Well, again, we have to use an override. So we could override to turn the fog off for this layer and to turn the fog off for this layer and keep it on for this layer, but it actually makes more sense to do it the opposite way. We just have to turn it off as the general state and then just turn it on for the fog state. I'm going to stop calling it fog, the atmosphere volume. So if we just go up to the master layer here, so if I turn on the visibility, we can just see the master layer. And we'll go back into the render settings, environment, atmosphere, click on here to go to fog, and we'll just turn this off. So there's no fog in the scene. Well, there is fog, sorry, there is no atmosphere volume in the scene, but we just turned its density to 0. So now if we go back to our foreground layer, you can imagine what we'll see here. We'll see the scene with no fog. So here we want to turn the fog on for, the atmosphere volume for the fog demo layer. So we can do that by going into making this layer visible, the one where we want to render the atmosphere. And then in the atmosphere node here, on density, the word density, will right click and say create absolute override for visible layer. So these options will start to show up as soon as you do have render layers. So an absolute override, so you can see it turns orange and it adds an absolute override here for this layer. And here we'll just change its value. And so this value will only apply to this layer. If we go to the background layer and turn on the visibility, you can see that's off now. Foreground, that's off. Master layer, it's off. So the fog will only turn on when we render, the atmosphere volume will only turn on when we render the fog layer. Okay, so we're almost there. So one thing we have to change, and technically probably two things we should change, but I'll just demonstrate it once. So if we look at this foreground layer and render it, it looks just like this, no fog. We have a good alpha channel that's cutting out the background. So in Photoshop, we can place that background render behind here or underneath it in the layer stack, and it will show up. But the problem is, well, let's demonstrate what the problem is. We'll just take a snapshot of this and we'll go back to the master layer here and we'll do a render. So here's the master layer rendering out. We'll take a snapshot of this and just take a look at the brightness of the floor between the two. So the only difference should be that the background word and the background wall are not included. Look in this shadow here, for example. So there is a difference. And remember, it's because this floor is reflective. This background image is bouncing light into the scene. So rendering the foreground without the background is good, except we need the effects of the background to be felt on the floor, on the objects in the scene. So we actually have to include it in our foreground render, but make it not primarily visible. So let me show you what I mean. Stop rendering there. So here in the foreground layer, we're going to add another collection. We're going to call this BG-Geo. So our background geo, and we'll just grab the background type and the background plane and drag it into this collection. Now, if we were to render this, you can imagine what it will look like. We'll just be back to where we started, because both of those collections will render here and we just see everything together again. So we have to tell Maya that we want the effects of these objects to be felt in the scene, their reflections, their visibility through transmission potentially, and things like that, but not to actually be visible. So to do this, we select these objects. So let's start with the background plane. And we go into the shape node for the background plane. And here under Arnold, we have visibility and primary visibility. You can see that you can turn off the shadow casting ability of this object, its appearance in diffuse reflections, specular reflections, and so on. We want all of those things to happen, except we don't want to see the object. So we can right-click on the attribute primary visibility, create an absolute override, and turn it off. That's only for this layer. We'll do the same thing here. Now, did I do that right? Yes, there it is. So when you do this, you want to make sure that you're working on the correct layer at the time and have that one visible. I wasn't sure that I had that visible when I did that. So let's try that with background type again. Oh, I just did it for background type. Oh, I guess I did it for both. I must have had them both selected here. So there's an absolute override on the primary visibility of the things in this collection. So now if we open the Arnold render view one more time, so you can see those objects don't appear here, but the floor looks exactly the same as in the beauty shot as compared to the render of the foreground without the background information coming into the scene. So take a look right in this area here, comparing this shot with this one. So snapshot 3 has the invisible wall in the background. Snapshot 1 does not. So technically speaking, we should do the same thing for the background layer. We should have a collection with the foreground objects, so they can appear as reflections in the background plane, and they're, the the light reflecting off of them will influence the background plate color. But I'm not going to bother doing that because it will make only minimal difference, and I don't really care in this case. It'll be good enough. But it made a significant difference in the foreground not to have those background objects reflecting light into the scene. Okay, so we're actually all done here. All that's left is to render. So how do we render these? Well, you could turn the visibility for each of these on one at a time and just do a render and save it out. Or we can use the render sequence or the batch render function. So to tell Maya that you want to render multiple layers when you set up a render, you have to have these render enabled icons turned on, these clapboards. So typically you don't want to render at the master layer as well. This will just be a beauty shot with everything in it, and you might for a single frame just to have. But if you are rendering at a sequence of 1,000 frames or something, and you don't need that master layer, you don't have to turn on the render ability for that. Okay, and all of our other render settings stay pretty much the same. You can change your render quality here with the Arnold renderer and so on. Back here in the Common tab, we're going to rename this to Demo Compositing Fog, and you have to choose the image format that you want to save as here. So the image format that I'm using is EXR, just leaving the compression type here as the default zip. And then the one thing I am changing here is half precision. So an EXR will render at 32 bits and can make really, as a 32-bit float file, so it's going to have a lot of information in there, more than we need, and can make a really large file in terms of storage memory. Half precision just makes it a 16-bit file, so it will have a lot of the editability that a higher bit depth will give you, as opposed to an 8-bit image that you would get with just a standard TIFF or something. So this is typically what I do for animation renders, or almost any type of render. Renders in EXR half precision. Now we're just doing a single frame, so we can just do name.ext extension. If you were doing an animation, you would change it to name.number.extension. The pound symbol or hashtag is the frame number. Okay, but for us, we just need a single frame. And you'll also notice that in the render settings here, you can access each of the different layers, and you can override things in the render settings too. We're not going to do this here, but you can override things such as the camera AA. You might not need as many samples for one of these layers. And so I could go to the foreground layer, create an absolute override here, and change this to 4 instead of 3, and so on. But I'm not going to bother doing that. So just close that. And then how do we launch this render? First, save your scene. And if you change to the rendering module here, you'll see a render menu option. And there are 2 ways to launch this render: render sequence and batch render. So you would use batch render only if you have the Arnold rendering license. That does not come with Maya by default. You have to pay for that separately. At least right now, at the time of this recording, you do. I have a license for Arnold. I think, although I don't know if it's actually accessing the license right now. But there is another way to get around that. You can use render sequence instead. So render sequence does not need a separate Arnold license to render without a watermark. The only difference is the interface is slightly different, and render sequence actually renders in front of you. So you'll see the render window come up and show you the images as they render, which is good. It makes you feel like you're getting things done, but it uses more system resources. and it stops you from doing anything in this Maya scene. Batch render actually makes a copy of the Maya file that you're working on and renders it out in the background. So technically you could keep working in the foreground if you wanted to do that. But let's just use render sequence here. And just another note, batch render, if you try and open the options, it tells you, why are you opening the options? Just go to the render settings. Which is true, but why then do you have that box? Render sequence, however, you can open the options and you can change some things here, the camera that you're using. You do want to make sure that all render enabled layers is turned on. And there are the things you might want to change if you have more than one camera. But for me, I don't have that. So I'm just going to say render sequence and close. And so it's going to open up and render the foreground layer. Then it's going to render the background layer, and then it will render the fog layer. So it has done all that. That's good. And now we'll just pop over to Photoshop. And let me just, this is my beauty shot. So I'll leave this open so we can compare. And now we'll bring in those other files. So we'll go to File, Open, and let's see. Done this a couple of times now. So foreground. So this is the one I just did, Demo Compositing Fog, and that's in the foreground layer. I probably should have done something to name them differently, but this is in EXR, so it wants to know about the alpha channel. So there's my foreground layer, and you can see that I do have a good alpha cut out here. Let's open up the other files we need. So renders, background, this one has the same name, unfortunately. Background layer, file, open. One more time. What did I call this? Fog demo, right? So we can bring this one in. So I'm lamenting the fact that I didn't rename my renders. So let me just pop back and show you how you would do that. Forgot about this. So if we go into the render settings, back in the common tab, right now my file name is just Demo Compositing Fog, and it's going to name everything that same thing. So if I put an underscore after this, right click on here, I could insert the render layer name here too. So it would add that to my file name. So I'd have one called Demo Compositing Fog Foreground, Demo Compositing Fog Background, and so on. I could also just get rid of this title and just have it name according to the render layer. Anyway, that would be smarter, but I didn't think of it. So now let's reassemble our image. So we have our background here, and let me just grab my foreground. So I need to take this out. If I just drag it over and hold down Shift, it'll bring in that black background, which is not what we want. So back in the foreground render, if we go into the channel palette, I'm on a PC, so I control click on the image of the alpha channel and we'll make a selection based on that. And then back in the image, I can, using my arrow key or my selection tool, I can click and drag, hold down Shift, and it will drop it into my scene here. And so this is pretty good. If we take a look now, we have our foreground layer on top of our background layer with the transparency as we want it, which, I'll just unlock the background layer, which allows us to do all the things that we want to do. Now we can blur the background separately. But now let's get our fog in the scene. Just drag it off so we can see. And now this one, it doesn't have a cutout in the alpha channel. We just have to drag the whole image in. So we're just using our selection arrow. Oops, I didn't hold down Shift. I dragged it onto the wrong layer, or to the wrong file. So just drag it in here, hold down Shift. And it went behind the fog layer, or the foreground layer. So I'll just drag it on top. And so it does what we would expect it to do. It's blocking everything because it has no alpha transparency to show the other layers through. So we simply select this top layer and we change its blend mode to linear dodge add. So just some sort of addition. I mean, you could use lighten too, would give you a slightly different look, but linear dodge add will make it look like our original. And you can see that some of these options are not available to us, and that's because we're working in 32-bit on EXR files. And so you can't do all the same types of blend modes. I'm not sure why, but I'm sure there's a good reason for it. So linear dodge add, and we're all good. So if we compare this now, our composited image, to our foreground image, it's pretty close. The difference is, look at the sort of shoulders of this torus here. This is our composited one. This is our beauty shot. And you can see the wall is actually being reflected on here. So it does actually make a difference not to do that second step. But I'm not going to go back now because who can be bothered, really, right? Yeah, and look at the side of this cube. You can see the bounce light lighting up this side a little bit more. So the wall is being reflected in there in the beauty pass, but we didn't account for that in our render layers, so we don't get that here. Anyway, I know this is a long tutorial, but it covers a lot of territory and important stuff that will be useful for doing still renders when you want to add the editability that you desire. And this also works for animations where you have to render out sequences of frames. But it's always good practice when you can to make your files as editable as possible in post, because it allows you to correct things without having to go back into 3D. Just for example, if this fog was too bright, I could simply turn down the opacity in this layer just to reduce the effect of that fog, rather than going back and re-rendering. Now, of course, if I did have to re-render that fog for some reason, and if I went back into Maya, then I could, if that's the only thing I had to re-render, I could turn off the renderability of foreground and background and now just render this layer. So it offers more efficient rendering and iterative rendering when you have to correct things inevitably that you have to correct. Anyway, that was a lot to go over, but I hope you found this useful, and I use this all the time, and it really has improved my workflow, and hopefully you'll find a place for it in yours.